Welcome to Lecture 1.2 on Natural Selection. So when I ask my students to describe to me what they first think about when I say the word evolution, the next word is Darwin. And I think it's a quite important thing that most people know Darwin's name, but most people don't really understand the context for the work that he did and the limitations of what he did versus what's been done in the last 150 years. So let's back up a little bit and go over some basics about Darwin. He was born in 1809 and he did not discover evolution. Evolution as a concept, which is the change of organisms over time, had actually been around for about 50 years. What's really significant about Darwin is not that he discovered evolution, but that he came up with the concept of natural selection, which was the first accurate mechanism for evolution. So in his 20s, he went on a trip around the entire world on a ship called the Beagle. And he was young, he would get seasick a lot, but whenever they would dock, he had to get out of the boat, and his responsibility was to take notes. He was a historian of nature, so he had to collect specimens and take lots of notes on them. When he returned to Britain, he spent a lot of time and energy observing patterns in nature. We would call that, in this day and age, studying natural history. He lived in a pretty rural area, and he had a lot of contact with agriculturalists and sort of the natural processes of the world. When he came up with the concept of natural selection, he wrote up his ideas, but he didn't actually initially publish them. His wife was really religious, and he didn't want to upset her or the small village that they lived in. He ended up waiting, and one day got a letter from a young man called Alfred Russel Wallace. He was a contemporary. He had gone to explore in South America and in Australasia, and he actually independently came up with the idea of natural selection. And when Charles Darwin saw that Alfred Russel Wallace was ready to publish his information, he got a bit nervous that he was going to be scooped. And a mutual friend of theirs helped the situation, and both of them were able to present their information on the same day. But because Charles Darwin was the older scientist and his description of natural selection was much more thoroughly explored, we refer to it as Darwin's theory of natural selection, not Darwin and Wallace's theory of natural selection. And I think this is an interesting story for you because it gives you the idea that people are independently coming up with the same ideas. It's a bit like in the late 1980s, we have two completely different evolutions of the personal computer. We have Dell and we've got Apple. And they couldn't have done it without having all of the information and science that had been developed before them. And that's true of Wallace and of Darwin. So briefly, the journey that Darwin took on the Beagle really was worldwide. And I want you to think about what this was like for somebody who lived in Victorian England. It was probably the most remarkable thing that anyone could possibly do. He traveled from the UK to Bahia, Brazil, all the way around the south of America to the Galapagos Islands, which are really quite important for some of his ideas, through to New Zealand, Sydney, Hobart, and Tasmania, all the way to the Cocos Islands, to Mauritius, Cape Town, South Africa, back to Bahia, and then all the way back to the UK. He took tons of specimens, and he was actually not very good at keeping notes. And so sometimes he would open boxes and you'd have all of these specimens that look very similar to each other without good notes. And surprisingly, those mistakes actually ended up precipitating some of his most important ideas. On the Galapagos Islands, which are a tiny set of islands off of the west coast of South America, there were two groups of organisms that were of particular importance to the development of his theory on natural selection. The first were the finches. There were many species of finches on the islands, and each of them appeared to be very well adapted to different sorts of foods and different sorts of habitats. And it turns out that all of these species evolved from a single common ancestor in South America. And they're a really good example of adaptation to local environments. The second charismatic species that was found on the Galapagos were tortoises. The Galapagos tortoises, there's many species of them, and the shape of their shells depend on whether they eat food high on trees or low on the ground. And they're very well adapted to their local environment. So let's have a look at his theory of natural selection. And I want to put it into the context of the scientific method. So if you refer back to the first lecture slides, the scientific method starts out with observations. So let's start there. The first of Darwin's observations is that there's overproduction. Most species have way more offspring than they need in order for replacement. Just think for a second about how many acorns come from a single oak tree. And ultimately, you only need one acorn to grow to replace that old oak tree. The second observation is that there's individual variation. If you just look around and compare yourself with your friends on Facebook, what you'll see is we are extremely variable in our phenotype, our external appearance. There's a lot of variation amongst individuals. Now, when you're looking at a wild animal, it can be easy to think that, well, they all look the same to me, but the variation can be subtle. It could be something like this tree is more tolerant of the heat than that tree is, or this one's got slightly faster reproductive capacity than another. So the features of variation aren't necessarily things that you can see with your own eyes. The first inference is called differential reproductive success. And it's the idea that individuals who have got features that are well adapted for their local environment are going to be able to reproduce and have more offspring that are fertile themselves. So if you think about that ancestor finch making it to the Galapagos Islands, those finches who had bigger beaks and could eat the larger seeds, if those large seeds were abundant, those individuals were more likely to survive because they would get tons of food. And when you've got lots of food, it's easier to feed your babies, and your babies will survive and reproduce as well. And your babies will inherit their big beaks from their parents. So the result of natural selection is what we call evolutionary adaptation. It's when you're adapted to your local environment, but the reason why you're adapted to your local environment isn't chance, it's evolution. This diagram is really important. It shows you the fundamental process of natural selection. Natural selection is a horribly simple mechanistic process. There's nothing magical about it whatsoever. So we'll start at the top. A single individual has some offspring, and as a result of natural mutations, there are variations in those offspring. The individual whose white perishes, it's selected against in the environment. Maybe it stands out from its background, maybe it doesn't have thermal heat tolerance that it needs, but it dies. So the dark grey individuals survive, and they reproduce. Now, this particular image shows individuals reproducing all at the same rate, but what if the dark grey individual, instead of only having one offspring each time, it had two offspring each time? It would very rapidly dominate that population, where most of the individuals in that population would be dark grey. But simply put, where you get mutations, favorable mutations are more likely to survive and reproduce, and unfavorable mutations are selected against. So over time, a population will slowly adapt to its local environment. Notice I said the word population. I didn't say an individual can evolve. Individuals do not evolve and adapt. Individuals survive or perish. Individuals reproduce a lot or a little. It's populations that undergo evolution. Now, there's evidence for natural selection everywhere, and I just picked a couple of my favorites. I happen to be into chickens, so I chose chickens. But here, let's start with one. Drug-resistant pathogens. This is a huge deal. Let's look at the picture. If you've got non-resistant bacteria, they can multiply. They're growing in your body. You've got an infection. And every now and again, there's a mutation in the DNA. And if that mutation happens to be in a part of the metabolism of the bacteria that allows it to be resistant to an antibiotic, when you take your antibiotic, all of the individuals that don't have that mutation will be killed, and those small number of bacteria that are resistant will survive, and then eventually they will reproduce, they will multiply and thrive. And so over time, very short amounts of time, you can get drug-resistant bacteria. So one of the common ones that you might know of is MRSA, or methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. It's found on most people at this point in time, but normally it doesn't cause too many problems. Malaria is caused by a protozoan called, I can't remember its name. Anyway, a protozoan, and that protozoan is also resistant to the anti-malarial drugs. And chlamydia, also known as the clap, which is a sexually transmitted infection, used to be very effectively treated with antibiotics. And we are now finding that there are antibiotic-resistant forms of chlamydia, which is a bit of a problem if you end up getting an STI. Pretty much every single domesticated plant and animal is evidence for natural selection. The variation and the specific qualities of the organisms that we use for food have been chosen by humans. We call that process artificial selection. Mechanistically, it's very similar to natural selection. The only difference is humans, not nature, does the selecting. So, for example, the ancestral jungle fowl lived in the jungles of Asia and has been now selected to create some very funny looking birds depending on humans' preferences for fanciful looking chickens. We also select for bigger, meatier birds, and that selection process has happened very quickly. If you compare the average size of a chicken in 1957 with one in 2005, they've increased in weight almost 5 times. So it's a pretty remarkable process. It's very easy to see. Find your favorite domesticated plant and animal and look up artificial selection. Look up the ancient wild version of what you're interested in and compare it to the modern breeds that we have available.